Hello, and welcome to Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I'm Zeckthar.
And I'm Yuksen.
We are the chroniclers of all that was, and all that will be in the 41st millennium. We've seen the rise and fall of many empires, and this month we'll be discussing the traitor marines known as the Iron Warriors. Iron within, iron without.
Indeed, this month we will chronicle how they came to be, their traits in war, and of course, notable characters. Well, Zeckthar, what are we going to be talking about this week?
Well, as usual, if we're going to discuss one of the first foundings of the Space Marines, we must start with their primarch. Perturabo, like all of his brothers, was boot-kicked into the galaxy by the ruinous powers and crash-landed on the very civilized planet of Olympia. Now, Olympia was an ancient human colonized planet in the marches of the Ultima Segmentum, on the opposing side of the galactic core from Terra, and was one of the number of worlds in the region heavily settled, it is believed, in the later days of the Dark Age of technology. Having survived the Age of Strife largely intact, scientific lore and industry on Olympia had regressed to a fractured but largely pre-atomic industrial level, but there remained stagnant as the sophisticated feudal culture had developed. Although relatively rich in organics and with a plethora of lithic mineral forms, much of its materials and easily available conductive metals have been strip-mined in antiquity and removed off-world, serving to enforce a bar on Olympia's progression technologically. Further complicating matters was the almost unbroken mountainous terrain, which dominated Olympia's land masses and made large-scale urbanization and agriculture impossible. These unique conditions bred an equally singular culture, which evolved into a diverse patchwork of hundreds of independent city-states and client satrapies. You know, brother, this reminds me very much of the Greek city-states in Terran 42, during the time before Alexander the Great. But regardless, we must press on. These dominated and fought endlessly over the vast verdant mountain valleys, sizable plateaus, and richest vales in a shifting web of power and warfare. A secular, opportunistic culture given to the pursuit of wealth, security, and dominance, the Olympian arts of war evolved towards a sublime mastery of fortress building, siegecraft, and stone masonry. On Olympia, power was the ability to not only take resources, but to defend them. The mountainous terrain, abundance of high-quality stone, and the ardenship to put it to use made the fashioning of elaborate keeps and guard vital passes and citadels to defend stockpiles of wealth and foodstuff essentials. These artificial wrought defenses were a murderous cunning and impregnable strength, and soon came to be the hallmark and measure of the greatest of the city-states and their rulers, the 12 most powerful, which were dubbed by ancient tradition the tyrants of Olympia. Warfare in this fractious realm was a complex game of cunning political subterfuge and assassinations mixed with all-out warfare. Olympia's incessant wars were fought between often mercenary armies of professional sellsword grenadiers and storm gunners, and sieges were carried out by steel-plated creeper tanks, clanking steam mortars, and hulking scout airships held aloft by volatile gases. This was the planet Perturabo crash-landed on as a wee babe, and it wasn't long before he made his mark. The full details of this early period in Perturabo's life remain somewhat mysterious, with the only accounts given to the Imperial Itinerators years later, and even distrusted even then as colored by Olympia's endemic intrigues. The most reliable information points to Perturabo as having been recovered from the rocky wilds outside the city-states by the tyrant's guards. They had been pursuing tales of a strange and wondrous boy wandering between outlying minor settlements and outcast communities, the boy plying his way both as a fighter for hire and an artisan of phenomenal talent despite his great youth, staying in no place for any length of time before moving on. Tales of the boy had reached Demekos, a shrewd and cunning ruler, and he had been intrigued enough to dispatch his retainers to find if any truth was in them, and if so, how indeed they could be turned to his advantage. Perturabo was discovered climbing the mountains below the walls of Lokos. The city guards, having realized this was no ordinary child, brought him before Demekos, the ruling tyrant of Lokos. On seeing the strange boy in the flesh, Demekos put him to the test, witnessing his ability to defeat warriors twice his size and many times his age in combat on the one hand, and on the other, the boy's ability to solve any puzzles he put to him by the tyrant's own scholars. Demekos was intrigued enough to offer the boy a place in his court. Between the boy and the tyrant, a bargain was struck. Fealty, loyalty, and service on the boy's part, and on that of the tyrant, patronage and protection, and access to the finest military training and scholarship the tyrant's resources could confer upon him. Later accounts differ of what came after. Many paint the boy as a prodigy of staggering and indeed inhuman ability, who spent his life in an unending regimen of solitary training and devouring whatever learning and lore was set before him. Others make veiled references to a child who is both cold and devious, the rapidly growing boy never fully accepting his lot, never truly trusted the Olympians, and refused to return any affection given to him by his adopted father. Demekos spent plenty of time with his new son, but never received any affection in return. There was a mysterious explanation for Perturabo's inherent mistrust, unknown to anyone but himself. Upon reaching the summit after climbing the rain-slick cliff, the exhausted youth had peered towards the heavens and gazed upon a strange, nebulous stellar maelstrom erupting across the corner of the heavens. When he inquired of the tyrant's guards whether they could see the strange phenomenon, the bewildered guards replied they could not. For the rest of Perturabo's life, the maelstrom would continue to look down upon the primarch, making him feel as if judged and measuring his worth and spied on his every moment. A life lived beneath its cold scrutiny made him brooding and loath to offer his trust, ever watchful and aware of its baleful glare. It would be over 2 standard centuries later before he found a reason to venture into the strange star Maelstrom's mercurial depths, a galactic phenomenon whose name he would coin, a name that would one day strike fear into the hearts of all that heard it. This stellar maelstrom, in truth, a great rift between real space and the immaterium, would one day be known as the Eye of Terror. Many Olympians saw the boy as a particularly cold and brooding child, though the fact that he was a genetically engineered superhuman who had been mysteriously thrown into a far-off world with no idea of his origins or purpose was certainly not conducive to the development of a trusting nature. Despite his aloof demeanor, the adopted boy learned from the culture in which he found himself the arts of the siege. For Olympia's myriad-wearing city-states afforded plenty of opportunity to study both the theory and the practice of this highly specialized branch of warfare. Upon his age of maturity, the foundling took the name for himself to be known all his adult life, but against custom he chose not to honor the family into which he had been taken by assuming one of the names of its venerated history as expected. Instead, he chose an ancient name that he had long favored, a name that some claimed had been found in a forgotten text from before the fall of humanity, a text written in a language only the boy, in his precocious ability, had succeeded in translating: Perturabo. Now, I hate to say this, Yuksen, but you do know what that word means, right? That happens to be actually our language. It's where we keep the stuff in the pantry. But I guess it sounded cool to him, but regardless. What true meaning it held, he did not divulge, because he didn't know, I think, but regardless. To war the young Perturabo now set himself, and in this he had much work to do. Demekos was a powerful tyrant, but he and his realm were beset by rivals and bitter vendettas on all sides, and having given an oath unbreakable, Demekos' enemies were now Perturabos. Granted first minor commands, the young Primarch ascended the ranks of his adopted house's armies at a frightening rate. Victory after victory followed under his command, and his legend grew, as did the mercenaries and war artisans, flocking to the banner of Demekos in their lust for success and plunder. But more than mere success in battle did Perturabo bring to Locos. And even from the beginning was his genius noted not simply for war, but also invention, having absorbed with superhuman clarity the breadth and depth of Olympia's science and artisanship. He soon surpassed it on every level, and from his chambers a constant stream of blueprints and discoveries sprung, encompassing everything from revolutionary new machines to equipment that dealt with architecture and production methods, and even groundbreaking works on medicine and astronomy. But it was first and foremost by his advances in warfare that Perturabo's dark fame was bred, and his legend as the Hammer of Olympia was born. New weapons, munitions, and hitherto unimagined siege engines were all birthed at Perturabo's hand, and in a brief span of years, it was they and Perturabo's own generalship, now as a warlord to the tyrant Demekos, that made Lokos the most powerful and feared domain in Olympia, with 100 others underneath its heel, and countless more cowed into de facto submission to its rulers. Perturabo's score upon score of military victories brought no peace to Lokos, however, only dominance and the growing threat of an enemy within, the assassin's blade and the poisoner's kiss. It is believed that a great many attempts were carried out upon the life of Lokos's Lord of Iron during this time, both by subjugated tyrants' reasoning, and rightly, that without Perturabo, Lokos's supremacy would crumble, and by those who, to Perturabo's face, called him family and friend, but who secretly held him in terror or jealous hatred. The primarch, now fully grown, towered over them all, both in stature and intellect, but cared little for the baubles and trappings of power, and nothing at all for the falsehood of court. Aloof, prideful, and justly wary of friend and enemy alike, Perturabo is depicted in the evidence of the time increasingly as a particularly bloody-handed warlord, even by the standards of his world, to whom mercy was an alien concept, and who would meet any insult with murderous violence. The steel executioner's mask and the ancient Kavethos heraldry, warning death to the transgressor, were Perturbo's signs and seals, and promised savage punishment in repayment of failure by those beneath him, just as it promised death to his enemies. It is of note that despite the fact that should he have wished it, Perturabo could have overthrown his master, Demekos, and displaced him as tyrant, he did not do so. The primarch, it seemed, would not break his word or his bargain willingly, and Demekos, for all of his vainglory and corruption, was careful never to give him cause or excuse to do so. It is thought, perhaps, that true to his oath, Perturabo would have let the aging Demekos die of natural death, as he remained unprovoked, hastened by the tyrant's own licentious excesses, before taking Lokos, and then all of Olympia, as his own in time. What he would have made of this world then can only be guessed at, for it was not to be. As a new star had been set in the heavens, the emperor had come for his lost son. Now, before you get to his true father's coming, I have a question for you, Yuksen.
Which is?
Now, obviously, for such a bright lad, arrogance came with his rising power. Yet, as an inventor, normally curiosity adds a bit of flavor to oneself, an ability to work with others. Yet, for everything I've found, not once did I find him wanting to work with his adopted kin. Now, part of me wonders if originally he actually did, perhaps grow some bonds of friendship with his family. Yet the pressures of leadership, along with the many attempts on his life through assassinations, makes me wonder if this is what caused him to distrust, to hold others at bay. So, my question is simple. Do you think it was simply Perturbo's character that made him such a cold-hearted figure? Or do you think it was more the environment?
Well, personally, I think it's surprising he isn't as paranoid as a lot of people with this constant feeling of being judged and looked at from a place that he doesn't even know. You know, the whole cloud thing, constantly judging him, apparently.
But I did want to mention it anyways. So as I was reading that, other than the one sentence that he asks the tyrant's guards about, and they go, "I don't know what you're talking about," how could we because he doesn't say anything about it ever again. So how could we possibly know that he's been looking at the eye of terror this entire time? Part of this, to me anyway, seems like it might be, and I wouldn't put it past the itinerators anyways of the Imperium, but perhaps a little bit of a propaganda for later on? Just a thought. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know.
Let me put it this way. Would it surprise you in the least, though?
No.
Okay. But anyways, sorry. But getting back to what you were saying, anyways, you think he would have been far more paranoid than he actually was if this thing kept,
Well, I think most people would be. It's like, okay, something's constantly watching you. That creates some sort of paranoia or complete or numb you to it, which obviously he didn't get numbed to it.
Well, speaking of paranoia, from everything that I've gathered about Perturabo, I've never pictured him as being very paranoid.
Yeah.
The only guy that I can think of that was a Primarch that seemed somewhat paranoid was probably Conrad Kurz. I can't think of any others. Can you?
No.
I mean, maybe Horus when he started to go insane, but I mean, that's different. But like I said, anyways, do you think anyways that it was just his character that made him kind of a cold fish, or do you think it was his environment?
Later, Perturabo did seem to get a bit more paranoid as time went on.
When are you thinking?
At the point where he started feeling more and more that everybody around him were becoming basically enemies.
Oh,
and he felt like, no, where he felt like everybody thought he was just dirt.
Well, yeah, that I think has to do a little bit more with his arrogance than it does paranoia. But we will get into that and probably after when you're done talking about him meeting his sons. But like I said before, anyways, do you think anyways this whole cold fish personality was his environment, or do you think it's just Perturabo? He was always going to be kind of this cold fish.
I think it's a mixture of both. I think the fact that they mentioned the fact that he would be constantly moving. He never actually showed any sort of actual attachment even before he met his foster father, or whatever you want to call him.
Demekos? Yeah.
Yeah. Because they only heard about him as being this person that would just be constantly wandering around. Right. So he obviously didn't feel like he fit in anywhere.
Right.
And didn't really care to obviously share much with anybody if it's just, oh yeah, there's this person who's walking around going from town to town.
I wonder if he had and it wouldn't surprise me anyways if he was one of those few. Okay, so let's see. We have Lehman Russ, who was raised by a wolf, right?
Right.
And then Conrad Kurz. I think that's the only other one anyways that really wasn't raised by humans. And Kurz, on Kurz's behalf anyways, he grew to a full adulthood without anybody. Yeah. As opposed to Lehman Russ, who eventually was found by Vikings, Fenrisians, and and was brought into the fold. So
right.
Yeah. So, but this whole concept of Perturabo, I wonder if he actually spent a lot of his time anyways as a child just by himself. And like it or not anyways, Perturabo was probably one of the smarter of the Primarchs. So I could see him actually figuring things out without people telling him how to, which to me is interesting. So I wonder if one of the reasons why he never really kind of settled down or anything was because he just, he just kind of figured, I kind of figured this stuff out myself and I'm just going to keep moving. Which
they mentioned how quickly he was able to adapt and think of things when it came to like technology and stuff like that. So he could have also had this feeling of, well, I have no common ground with any of these people either because I'm just so far out there in comparison to everybody else.
Well, I kind of wondered too, anyways, when I was talking about that, I kind of wonder what would have happened if he had kind of the upbringing that Vulcan did. Like he was found by a smithy. I wonder if it would have drastically changed his character. I mean, it definitely anyways left a huge mark on Vulcan's character. And I think we actually find this actually with a lot of the Primarchs. If you stop and think about it, their characters are really defined on the. I know that they grow expediently and very fast, but we see that a lot of their characters are actually kind of a lot of it is in their younger years, which develops.
Especially the kids of Horus, where one word and poof,
I remember everything, and then
I remember everything, and I happen to grow like 3 feet.
well, not only that, but he also, for a call right, anyways. I mean, immediately after that, anyways,
My name is Horus.
But like I said, anyways, but then after that, anyways, he was actually the only one, as far as I know, anyways, that was pretty much raised by the Emperor once he got there. But anyways, well, thank you for your input. I agree with you as well. Anyways, I do think it was kind of a combination of the two. And that's why I also kind of mentioned, anyways, what if he had met up with like a smithy, like Vulcan did? Because that would definitely have drastically changed his environment when he was growing up.
It depends. In the case of Vulcan, it wasn't just the fact that he had met up with a smithy. It was the whole place was basically just one family, which is kind of similar to, for example, Russ.
Right.
When he was raised both, by wolves. And then later by the original Wolf King before he took on that title.
Right.
It was also very, basically, this is one huge family.
Right.
Which is the case with the majority of the lesser, modern, non-Greco-Roman stylized cultures that some of these people ended up on.
Right. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us anyways what happened when the Emperor showed up?
Well, regardless of what we think, in time, the Emperor arrived on Olympia as part of the Great Crusade, informed Perturabo of his true place in the wider galaxy. Such evidence that remains of the recovery of Perturabo and his installation in the forces of the Great Crusade indicates that the process occurred swiftly and with immediate acceptance on Perturabo's part, in marked contrast to several other Primarchs. It is likely that the tyrant Demekos was more than willing to bring Olympia into the Imperium's fold as its satrap, and the price of voluntarily releasing Perturabo from his service was but a small due to pay. Perturabo, for his part, it is believed, had already reasoned out his true nature, at least in the abstract, as an artificial post-human being, and indeed expected his creator to one day be revealed to him, even though the particulars no doubt remained a mystery until the Emperor himself appeared in orbit with his fleet. After his rediscovery by the Imperium, the young Primarch was brought to Terra to learn from his father about his chosen destiny and to meet some of his brother Primarchs. During his studies, Perturabo learned of the ancient people known as the Ferenzi. Captivated by the history of the past, Perturabo and his brother Magnus of the Thousand Suns spent many months together in search of the buried secrets of mankind's past glories that had been swept away in the chaos of the Age of Strife, known by Terrans as Old Night. It was the esoteric writings of the world's former masters that most interested him. He cared more for the ancient philosophies of the lost civilizations of Terra than their mechanical wonders, but it was a heady time of exploration for both Primarchs. Perturabo got along well with his brother Magnus, for both Primarchs shared a love of learning and a hunger to know new things.
What? Wait a minute. I thought Perturabo didn't get along with anybody.
Well,
okay, before you get
later
started.
on, yes.
Okay, before you start to explain this, I just got this mental image, and we have to find information about this. But I can just see Magnus and Perturabo, like Terran 42's Indiana Jones, hunting through,
No,
lost
you have to
civilization.
Wait. Oh, right.
The bullet was rolling down on them. They both look at each other, just kind of chuckle, and just hold their hand out as they stop it. Yeah, I could just see them anyways. The ultimate architects.
You mean archaeologists?
Or sorry, yes, archaeologists. Yeah.
Well, he was an amazing architect, but
Yeah. Could you just imagine Perturabo in the wide brimmed hat of Indiana Jones? What would that make Magnus? Oh, what's his name? The guy who eventually ended up playing Gimli,
yeah.
his buddy. Yeah.
The one that always call him Indy.
Yeah.
Indy. Indy, that's what we named the dog.
Yeah, sorry. But yeah, I just got this mental image of them anyways, like with the brush.
Protect me with my fist, and then it's actually the back of a truck. The truck just leaves.
But anyway, sorry. Go ahead. But yeah, so Perturabo actually had a friend, Magnus? Surprising me.
If when it comes to things, they were both scholars in a sense. So I can kind of see that camaraderie in comparison to, like, for example, we were just talking about before, we were talking about his time on Olympia. It seems like pretty much all the studying and learning that he was doing was by himself because everybody else was just, either whatever or...
Well, that might be also the key anyways of why they actually got along so well, is because this is probably the first guy that Perturabo has talked to that he hasn't thought was an idiot. He's like, wait, you have a brain on your shoulders too? We should hang out, know? But anyway, sorry. I mean, from everything that I've ever read anyways, it just seemed like Perturabo always just kind of kept everybody at bay.
Well, in the future, that
it starts to shift
more and more.
Yeah, if I recall right, well, like I said, I didn't even know that this friendship existed, but apparently, anyways, later on, anyways, it stales. It's probably the best way to describe it. But sorry, carry on.
It stales.
Yes.
Perturabo was not a primarch to whom the natural ebb and flow of friendship came easily. His friendship was not easily achieved, but his loyalty, once won, was as unbreakable as the hardest iron. Or so he had thought, until time would show him that even the hardest iron would break if worn thin enough. It was remarked upon at the time of his early reception in a number of sources just what a ravenous mind the newfound Primarch possessed. While all of the Emperor's post-human sons displayed an intellect and capacity to absorb and adapt to new knowledge that surpassed that of the unmodified human, Perturabo's capacity for learning was truly incredible, and it swiftly came to be said that of all the Emperor's sons, he was the most gifted in terms of raw scientific and technical intelligence. Much of this sagacity was turned inwards, however, and Perturabo was from the outset a distant, calculating mastermind who cared little for the society of others, nor readily deigned to explain his actions or intentions to those around him, even to his fellow primarchs upon meeting them, who he is cold and guarded against to the point of bristling indifference. To the Emperor, such foibles mattered little, and in Perturabo he found a new weapon for the arsenal of the Great Crusade, a warlord and general whose savage might was only eclipsed by his razor-keen intellect. To Perturabo, each battle and each campaign was no more than a problem to be objectified, deconstructed, and overcome, and it would not be long before the first of mankind's foes would feel the terrible power of this murderous mind in the galaxy. In time, the Emperor was ready to send his son back out into the galaxy to help with the galactic conquest known as the Great Crusade, an effort to reunite all of mankind beneath the rule of the newborn Imperium of Man. Perturabo, like his fellow primarchs before him, ascended to the crenellated peak of the Stardays Tower to swear his oath of moment. He made the long ascent upwards to the polished marble spire the night before leaving Terra for a life of war. Each step required a superhuman effort of will, determination, and courage. It was not simply a physical ascent, but a challenge to the heart and intellect, a psychic communion with the emperor himself that tested the very boundaries of a warrior's endurance. Perturabo pledged his devotion to the fledgling Imperium and assumed the mantle of primarch and commander of the 4th Space Marine Legion, whom he renamed the Iron Warriors. According to established practice, the primarch was declared lord of the world on which he had been raised, effectively deposing his adoptive father, the tyrant of Locus, as the most powerful ruler on the world. Given command of the 4th Legion, which had been created from his own genome, Perturabo ordered the Iron Warriors to begin the process of inducting new recruits from the most able candidates amongst the peoples of Olympia. Demekos is said to have spent his remaining few years gathering forces to attempt to retake his power and overthrow Perturabo and the Imperium's rule of Olympia. Demekos failed in these efforts at rebellion, but created a current of anti-imperial political unrest among the people of Olympia, which would come to haunt Perturabo and his Iron Warriors later. Now, at the time, around 35,000 Astartes of the 4th Legion had been mustered to create his independent command, with perhaps half that number again scattered across the conquered domains of the Imperium in smaller independent garrisons and detachments bound to their watches and their duties. Having instituted a full review of the 4th Legion's war record, doctrines, and practices, and having compared those to the other legions, Perturabo found his sons wanting and acted accordingly. His punishment was decimation. For the legions failing, all would suffer, all were guilty. As the edict of decimation would state,
War is unequivocal, uncaring, unforgiving, and blind. Blind also will be the selection of those who will pay the blood price for the greater failure of your record.
1 in 10 of the legion, determined by lottery, was put to death without honor, a deed carried out by the legionaries' own comrades with their bare hands. At this bloody edict, some within the imperial court protested, believing that the emperor had given absolute power of a Space Marine Legion to a madman, while others, more guarded in their criticism, opined only that command had been given too soon to the primarch, unused as he was to the ways of the Imperium. Loudest of these critics was Rebrute Gilman, of course, primarch of the Ultramarines, who bridled at the ignominy of the deaths to which the valiant Astartes, warriors alongside which his own legion had often fought, had been thus consigned. It was a spur of discord between the two primarchs that, though later eclipsed by other rancors and feuds among the emperor's sons, would be one that neither would ever forget. All such criticism the emperor silenced. To those who survived the 4th Legion's self-decimation, the lesson was plain. Such was to be the rule of Perturabo, ruthless and unforgiving, and without favor or preference. Death would be the price of failure in Perturabo's service, and war was to him a binary equation. Their sin was not that they had failed in the Great Crusade service, for by no measure had this been the case, but instead that they had not reached their full potential. It was not enough for Perturabo that they were merely superior. Their faults lay in that, among the legions, they were not already supreme. Perturabo demanded that his legion would be a peerless engine of war, and he immediately set about fashioning it into the weapon he desired it to be, a weapon whose edge he would first test against the rest of the Meritara cluster, at whose edge the Olympia Majoris star system sat. There he first overthrew the vaunted Black Judges and claimed their once held domain for the Imperium, before purging the Xenos Ectosaurids of Veraconia and subjugating the renegade knight fiefdom of Lixos, completing his conquest of the cluster. In this last conflict, Perturabo's legion ended by force a schism that had lasted for millennia back into the age of strife between the fragmented empire and its former masters in the Mechanicum, winning the legion much favor with the lords of Mars. This period was for the Fourth Legion a winnowing, a time of trials and testing at their primarch's hand. With calculated forethought and savage experiment, Perturabo remade the legion to his own image. An image not echoing the Olympian or Terran ideal, but one fashioned purely from his own bleak and unflinching ruthless psyche. At the end of the Meritara cluster campaign, the Fourth Legion of old was no more, and the Iron Warriors had been forged from blood and fire in their place. By the time Perturabo returned again to Olympia with his renamed force, the machinery of his plans was well into effect. In alliance with the Mechanicum, new orbital shipyards and foundries burned with frenetic activity. Many had been torn from dead orbits around conquered stars, dragged to Olympia and refitted and expanded to his legion's purpose. The worlds of the Meritara cluster, too, now paid their tribute of flesh and blood to the Lord of Iron, to feed the legion's hunger for fresh warriors, weapons, and munitions. All was by Perturabo's hand and design. In the crucible of war, the Iron Warriors had undergone its reshaping, with the changes that had occurred seen in many ways to have amplified what was already present in the Fourth Legions rather than changing it beyond recognition. Where once the Legion had been ruthless in its willingness to accept losses in return for victory, now it was utterly driven to the point where such considerations were as beneath it as mortal fear. War had become a deadly equation which the Iron Warriors were supremely suited to solve. A relentless, unyielding engine of war, a beast of steel and fire which swept worlds clean and devoured whole armies. At the head of the newly constituted force, the 125th Expeditionary Fleet, into which Perturabo drew the bulk of his legion's strength, the Primarch had commanded of a force which quickly became the battering ram of the Great Crusade. As they fought alongside each of their fellow legions in turn, they gained an unmatched reputation for brutal efficiency in battle, mastery of armored warfare, and as artillerists without peer among the legions. It is said of the Iron Warriors that there was no fortress built by the hand of humanity or that of the Xenos they could not smash down, no strongholds they could not storm, and no army they could not drown in its own blood through shot and shell. I wonder, brother, do you think the Emperor sent the Iron Warriors on the worst missions in the Great Crusade because he thought his son didn't think much of them either?
The funny thing is that it does look like Perturabo doesn't really care for his warriors. I think that's not really the case. I think that he thinks that they're better than everybody else. So when you say anyways that they get sent on the worst missions, I think he was the victim of his own hubris, if that makes sense. So it was just, and I think the Emperor used it too. It was just kind of along the lines that he would get a hold of Perturabo and he'd be like, well, this mission is nearly suicidal. I was thinking of sending your boys, but I didn't want to lose any of your mighty Iron Warriors. Is there anybody else that could do it better? And of course, Perturabo would be like, well, no, we have the best troops in all of the legions, kind of thing. And so the Emperor would be like, oh,
good. Go.
Yeah, exactly. So I think anyways, and like I said, I really honestly think that Perturabo was actually fairly prideful of his troops. But I think anyways that he kind of, because of this pride, they would end up doing all the dirty jobs. I do think though that that what ends up happening though is that because he does think they are the best, and he does send them on all these horrible missions, and they do succeed, even though a lot of them end up dying. What he's not hearing back is praise. It's not
Right.
Well done again, son,
kind of thing. It's very much oh, good, you made it. All right, well, let's send you on another suicide mission.
Right.
I mean, so I think he starts to get a little cantankerous about that. But what do you think?
Okay, so the only other thing before moving on, I think, is I find it funny how how we did the White Scars a few months back,
Yeah.
and how they used notice how they use same excuse or criticism with Jagatai that they use here also. He isn't the right type of person because he isn't civilized like the Imperium is. He isn't up to the latest stuff. He should be put in charge.
Well, the funny thing that I find about that is that, okay, I can kind of see it a little bit more Jagatai Khan because of the history of his planet and where he grew up. They were very, very anti-imperial. They were much more nomadic. They had a different concept anyways on how to live. Very much like another guy anyways that they said kind of the same thing about not Ferris Manus. Sorry, my bad. Lehman Russ. Growing up on,
they didn't say that. Ironically, they didn't say that about Vulcan. Came from a planet that really wasn't similar to the Imperium. If you think about it,
yeah, Vulcan though is kind of a different animal. I mean, I think the reason why no one said that about Vulcan was because Vulcan's the the lovable giant. I mean, he's the guy anyways that kind of hung out with the Emperor for a while, and all of his brothers got to know him. He's just kind of this, kind of this obtusely different person that they're all like, okay, he's here. Wow, he's big. That's about all they could get. And then when he gets to, joining his crew and his sons, the way he deals with them is so much different than anybody else. He deals with them with empathy and if I recall right, Yuksen, the first time he meets his legion, he actually kneels to them and says, "You guys did such a great job," which is unheard of by any Primarch. So I would put Vulcan in a different camp on this. The thing that I find interesting about Perturabo, though, is that he came from, as opposed to these other Primarchs that we were talking about, he came from a planet that was considered civilized.
that's why it's like almost this is their default thing. Well,
no. Like you said, anyways, that seems like their default thing. But the thing that is interesting about it is that as opposed to the guy that you just talked about, Jagatai Khan, Perturabo came from a civilized planet. It's almost like they were thinking he should know better, which to me is kind of funny because decimation, by the way, isn't an unheard thing of in the Imperium. So I think a lot of this had more to do with, anyways, Rabute Gilliman kind of being, he knew these guys. He's like, they didn't do anything wrong. Like, well, they're not the best. No, of course, my guys are the best. They shouldn't be. I think that kind of stuck a little bit in Gilliman's craw, but it's kind of my 2 cents.
Well, interesting thoughts, brother. But if we are going to talk about Perturabo, we must discuss his arch nemesis, his own brother, Rogel Dorn.
Right you are, brother.
Now, we won't get too much into Rogel Dorn because, after all, he deserves his own Vox. But what I can say is the familiarity breeds contempt.
Meaning?
Well, of all of his brothers, Rogel Dorn was probably the closest to Perturabo. And what I mean by that is not that they were close in kinship like Ferris Manus and Fulgrim, but by the way that they thought was very similar. I mean, both were brilliant in siege warfare. Perturabo having a slight edge when it came to drawing up sieges, while Dorn was second to none, other than maybe perhaps Perturabo, when it came to building impregnable fortresses. Both were great tacticians and generals, and neither gave their loyalty often. Yet when they did, it was normally to the death or being betrayed. There were some slight differences which honestly started a feud between the two, and eventually brought Perturabo to Horus's side in the heresy. The main difference was very simple. Rogel Dorn was admired and loved for his brilliant strategies and tactics, while Perturabo always played the second fiddle.
I see where you're going, brother, but perhaps for those listening, you give a little bit more understanding.
But of course, when Rogel Dorn conquered a world and built a new world up as a mighty fortress, his brothers and his father said it was glorious. No one could ever do as well as Rogel Dorn. Yet, when Perturabo did the same thing, and perhaps his foundations or tactics were equal or even slightly better than his brothers, his father simply nodded that it was done, and his brothers did the same at the most. Yet all the while told him how his brother, Rogel Dorn, did so much better, and he should learn from it. Regardless what he did, Rogel was gold, the perfect son, while Perturabo was gray, the outcast.
Now, brother, we both know a lot of this was in his own mind.
Really? Was it? I mean, think about it. I mean, it seems like every time that Rogel Dorn did something that Perturabo did, he was considered like the greatest of all time, as opposed to Perturabo, who was just kind of like, oh, yeah, you're doing your thing. I mean, okay, a good example of this actually is, so I didn't really get into this, but the crux of why Perturabo turns traitor is because after, as per usual, all these things anyways takes place after the Ulunor Crusade or campaign, right? This is where Horus is given the mantle of War Master, and the Emperor doesn't tell anybody why he did that or anything. He just goes later and leaves.
He just pieces out and goes away.
Yeah, exactly. And in my brother's own eloquent words, the Emperor said, "Peace." So,
wait, where are you going? I'm not telling you. You don't trust us? I trust you a lot. Then why won't you tell us?
I don't know. But before he leaves, he goes ahead and garners Rogel Dorn and says, I need you to inspect and fortify Terra. Okay? And and this is already, by the way, Perturabo is already kind of annoyed at the fact anyways that Horus was named War Master. I mean, like we've said before, Perturabo is fairly arrogant, and you know, in his mind, he's obviously going, well, why not me? I mean, I've built, like Yuksen was just saying anyways, he built his Space Marines into like the greatest warriors, so why not me? But Horus, he kind of, you know, in his own mind, he can kind of understand it because Horus is kind of chummy with everybody, especially the Emperor. But then Rogel Dorn, anyways, gets sent back to Terra to build these fortresses. And with him goes, or at some point along the lines, Fulgrim gets to talking with Rogel Dorn. And he asks Rogel Dorn if the Imperial Palace, once it's done being fortified, could it withstand an assault by the Iron Warriors? Now, Dorn's pretty prideful in of himself. But he honestly believes, he says, no, Perturabo couldn't do squat against my mighty fortresses. And Fulgrim, being Fulgrim, goes back and just is just itching to tell Perturabo this whole thing. And when he does, Perturabo acts the way that he does. He gets angry, he gets violent, he throws a few people. It's just, you know... It's just him. So, yes, like I said, anyways, is this all in his mind? I think, anyways, a lot of the arrogance is in his mind. But honestly, he's probably one of the smartest primarchs. And not only that, but could he have been War Master? Tactically, he could. in my opinion. The problem was is that he didn't have the same thing Horus did, which was the communication with his other brothers. That was the big thing. But I mean, honestly, the whole argument between Rogel Dorn and Perturabo, to me, is just, it's actually kind of frustrating. It's because, like I said before, Rogel Dorn is portrayed as this great and mighty leader. No one could compare with Rogel Dorn when it came to tactics and strategies. No one was better than Rogel Dorn when it came to being able to be fluent in battle and do things that even Lehman Russ and Jagatai Khan couldn't do. And I say that anyways, because not because I believe it, but that was the propaganda. That was the thing that surrounded Rogel Dorn.
And let's face it, he wore gold.
Perfect.
He wore the same colors as the Emperor, so of course he has to be.
Rogel Dorn was considered, and I said this before, but Rogel Dorn was considered the perfect son. And ironically, I will say this anyways, up until what you're going to be talking about here in a little bit, Rogel Dorn never actually had lost by this point, which, I mean, that sounds great, but at the same time, as you well know, Yuksen, anyways, we learn the most when we lose. We learn how to better ourselves. And if you just continually win, things start to fracture. But, okay, so out of the two...
There are rare cases where it's because the person's afraid that they will lose instead of having this attitude of, you know, I will always win. Those people can tend to, if they're constantly going, okay, I need to learn so that I do not lose. Those people also tend, though, to flourish.
They either flourish or becomes a canker in their thought process, because it's just they're so paranoid about losing that it actually becomes a problem. But regardless, Rogel Dorn was neither of these two. He just had always won, so he just always expected to win. But like I was about to say, anyways, before we move on, anyways, what do you think of these two? Because they do think fairly similarly.
Well, I don't care much for either of them personally, but for Dorn, because it wasn't as bad as Sanguinius, where everybody's just like, yes, Sanguinius is the best, you know.
I will mention here, brother, that I've done a little bit more research on Rogel Dorn after the Horus Heresy, and I think if you read a little bit more into him at that point, his character drastically changes, and he does become, in my opinion, anyways, a far superior character. His character gets better, but anyways, at this time, anyways, so. Who do you think is actually smarter? Who do you think should have been glorified?
In comparison to Dorn, who's been known for his main thing he's been known for is fortification. Now he is excellent with all this other stuff, but when you see the comparisons between different primarchs, generally there's like, oh yes, night and day, this and that.
Mm-hmm. You don't see that though with these two.
It's not the same, because you don't hear anything about, yes, Dorn is excellent when it comes to siege warfare. You don't hear that at all.
Oh no,
you like a mastermind at siege warfare.
Oh no, you hear about that quite a bit. It's just not nearly as proclaimed as Perturabo. That's the interesting part. Is that this is the only two things, anyways, that they seem to have a slight edge over the other one.
Right.
Rogel Dorn is So Rogel Dorn is known for his fortresses and defense.
So, in my opinion, I think Perturabo is more intelligent, but that's also because I think he was also had more conflict that he had to reshape and build off of.
You know, it kind of reminds me of a guy from Terran 42, an orange-haired fella, who is actually fairly smart, but can never actually say the right thing. that was the big problem I think that Perturabo has. He never really could get the politics of it. I mean, could you imagine anyways if Perturabo had the same brilliance that he does anyways, but had the ability to get people to like him like Sanguinius did? I mean, no one would even really talk about Rogel Dorn. I mean, okay, well, regardless of what we think, Perturabo let these dark thoughts seep into his brain until eventually he betrayed his father and joined his brother Horus in the heresy. The true test of who was the better man would be put to the test during the siege of Terra. And I believe you, Yuksen, have the notes on this.
Quite right, brother. Perturabo proved to be a pivotal and primary traitor commander during the Solar War. During the campaign to capture the Sol system, he oversaw the capture of both the Uranus and Jupiter defensive spheres from the Imperial Fists. During the early stages of the Siege of Terra, Perturabo was not allowed to lead the siege of the Imperial Palace, but instead fortify the Sol system against Guilliman's expected arrival, something that embittered him greatly. Nonetheless, the Lord of Iron was able to review bombardment data and surmise a weakness in the palace's Void Shields network. Horus later met with Perturabo personally aboard the Vengeful Spirit, where, while still compelled to obey Horus, he now saw the War Master as little more than a slave to the ruinous powers. Horus attempted to appeal to Perturabo's pride, emphasizing how much he appreciated the Lord of Iron's contributions and how he was the only primarch he could still trust. Perturabo was, however, still denied the coveted duty of besieging the palace, instead being ordered to clear the landing zones for the traitor titans. After weeks of fighting, the traitor war effort stalled in the face of the walls of the palace, and the demon primarchs proved aloof and unreliable. Horus thus relied on Perturabo to conduct the main offensive push into the Lion's Gate spaceport. Hoping to overcome Dorn's traps with bluntness, Perturabo put Kroger in charge of the ground offensive while inserting Foryx and a unit of Iron Warriors behind enemy lines to seize key bridges into the spaceport. However, the attack stalled in the face of the Emperor's psychic shield of the palace, forcing Perturabo to rely on the Immaterium by having Zardu Layak and Typhus summon Korvax Utterblight to subvert the Imperial Palace's population. During the main assault on the Lion's Gate spaceport, Perturabo revealed that Foryx and his men had been sacrificed as a ruse in order to draw away Imperial Fist defenses, in order to allow the Iron Blood to dock within the spaceport's main spire. As Perturabo set down, Rogel Dorn met him on the field of battle. However, Perturabo refused to be goaded into battle by Dorn's taunts, knowing the Imperial Fist Primarch simply intended to buy time for his troops to withdraw. Perturabo instead promised that only after he had torn down the palace would he kill Dorn. Following the fall of Lion's Gate, Perturabo landed on Terra's surface and set up a command center to direct the siege. With Horus increasingly losing touch with the Materium, it fell to Perturabo to command the war effort, and he became the face of the enemy to the defenders of Terra. With the blessing of the War Master, Perturabo controlled his allies through a command staff that consisted of Abaddon and the Mournival, Ahriman, Typhus, Eidolon, and Krostavok. Perturabo directly connected himself to the traitor data network, absorbing enormous quantities of data and directing every facet of the siege with his own mind. In this state, commanding the greatest siege in history, Abaddon suspected that Perturabo was finally happy. In an uncharacteristically good mood, Perturabo praised Abaddon when he noticed the same flaw in the Saturnine gate that he recently had also discovered. However, Perturabo was worried that Dorn also knew of the flaw, and exploiting it would be a trap by his brother. As a result, he allowed Abaddon and the Emperor's children to attack Saturnine and suffer the losses and humiliation that would come with it. should the assault fail. Sure enough, Dorn had known of the flaw and ambushed the traitors as they attacked. After the setback at Saturnine, Perturabo began to despair over the state of his allies. All save he and the Iron Warriors had by now fully fallen to chaos, and with his warriors marched all kinds of warp abominations. Perturabo realized that the war was no longer one of legion versus legion, and the ultimate test against his brother Rogel was now tainted. The final straw for Perturabo came after Horus informed him that he was to disperse his Iron Warriors amongst the various war zones, and that his position would be taken over by Mortarion and the Death Guard. Finally, having had enough, Perturabo ordered the Iron Warriors to evacuate Terra and withdraw to the Iron Blood. Later, aboard the Iron Blood off Mars, Perturabo watched the data coming in regarding the final actions of the siege of Terra. He violently raged at being denied what should have been his greatest triumph, destroying whatever can be found around him with Forgebreaker. Now hating both sides equally, Perturabo contemplated killing Horus once he inevitably prevailed. Perturabo realized he would need further power to survive in a sea of enemies, and began to wonder how to evolve himself into something far deadlier. Although, just as a quick note, it cannot be known whether Dorn's masterfully constructed defenses would have proved the undoing of the Iron Warriors, for Horus was slain by the Emperor before the matter could be fully determined.
Very true, brother. And although neither brother could claim victory, Perturabo's hatred only intensified as he fled from the disaster that was the siege of Terra. Horus had failed, and thus all was lost. As the traitors began to fall back towards the Eye of Terror, Perturabo got an idea. A horrible idea. An idea that made even the Grinch of Christmas from Terran 42 to grin. He set a trap for his nemesis, his brother, Rogel Dorn. He would use the thing he hated about his brother and himself as the trap. Dorn's pride. The snare was set on the planet known as Sebastus IV.
Now, before my brother starts on this, he did a much fuller concept of it in his Vox Rogel Dorn's Defeat at the Iron Cage.
Yes, brother. Well, I did do that. And by all means, you fine folks should check it out. You kind of gave away the ending of how this thing was going to go.
True, brother. Very true. But for those of you who haven't listened to it...
Yes. Well, where was I? Aha! The trap was known as the Eternal Fortress, a massive keep centered within 20 square miles of bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, tank traps, and redoubts that were intentionally shaped to look like an 8-pointed star of chaos. Upon hearing of the existence of the supposedly impenetrable redoubt maintained by his legion's hated rivals, Rogel Dorn publicly declared that he would dig Perturabo out of his hole and bring him back to Terra in an iron cage. Rogel Dorn expected an honorable battle, but this was not to be, which was laughable. I mean, this is war after all. Anyways, beginning by isolating the 4 companies of the Imperial Fists that arrived to do battle from their orbital support, Perturabo began to carefully divide his enemy and destroy them piecemeal. Some Imperial Fists managed to penetrate the defenses and reach the center of the Eternal Fortress, only to find there was no central keep, simply an open space watched by yet more defenses. The fortress was a decoy of no real value, surrounded by 20 miles of killing ground. By the 6th day of the siege, the Imperial Fist Space Marines were fighting individually, without support, using the bodies of their own battle brothers for cover. The siege of the Eternal Fortress, later referred to in Imperial history simply as the Battle of the Iron Cage, lasted for a further solar 3 weeks. The only reason Rogel Dorn and what remained of his son survived was because relief came in the form of Rabute Gilliman and his Ultramarines, who drove off the Iron Warriors. But the siege left Rogel Dorn a broken man and rendered the Imperial Fist chapter unable to fight for 19 standard years while they rebuilt their forces. The gene seeds of over 400 Imperial Fists were captured by the Iron Warriors in the Iron Cage and later sacrificed to the nefarious purposes of the Dark Gods, an accomplishment for which Perturabo was also finally elevated to the rank of Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided by the rare acclamation of the Ruinous Powers.
What?
I know, brother. And we can get into that in a minute. But moving on. Following this victory, the Iron Warriors fled to the Eye of Terror, alongside the fellow traitor Marines, and secured a new demon world named Mendragod, crafting a terrible demonic fortress world where his sons ruled a miserable slave population from vast citadels of iron and stone. Today, the Iron Warriors give the greatest loyalty to Perturabo for saving them from what they believe was an unwarranted sacrifice in the name of the false emperor of mankind. Now, all right, brother, let's hear it. It's something that confuses me too. Why? Why would Perturabo become a demon prince?
It makes no sense. Quite literally, when I was even talking about the siege of Terra, he was like, everybody is falling to chaos. I don't want to. Everything's now against me because everybody's fallen to chaos or was already trying to kill me.
This is one of those few times in history that I just can't make rhyme or reason of it. This makes no sense. I mean, to put it bluntly, isn't it right, Yuksen, that if an Iron Warrior starts to see mutations in one of their ligaments or arms anyways, they literally cut it off and replace it with iron?
From what I remember, yeah.
So the concept that he would actually give himself over to the ruinous powers, I don't understand it. Is there anything you can possibly think of that this makes sense?
The only thing I can think of is if he needed like greater support when it came to creating demon machines. But even then, that's not that huge of a. That isn't a great argument to make either.
I was gonna say that's a pretty terrible argument, Yuksen. One that I definitely wouldn't make. But yeah, I'm with you. I don't understand why he would do such a thing. The only thing that I can think of, is he didn't have a choice.
You mean like Mortarion?
No. Mortarion did have a choice.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, he did. Let either die horribly with his entire unit.
Yeah.
Or
he did have a choice. It wasn't a very good choice, but he still had a choice. What I'm talking about is along the lines of he was just like, okay, everybody else anyways, yeah, chaos. We got to make it into the Eye of Terror, right? So here's some gene seeds for you guys. Yay. And he goes about to do whatever he wants, and all of a sudden the Chaos Gods go, you know what? We're going to make you a demon primarch. And he's like, no, that's okay. I don't need that. And they're like, too bad. Poof. And they turn him into a demon primarch. That is the only thing I can think of. It's not even a choice. It was just kind of like, ta-da! We did this. Aren't you happy? No, I'm not happy at all. You know? Well, too bad. Poof. And then they disappear. That's honestly the only thing I can really think of. And that even in of itself, it doesn't seem to really track well.
No.
I mean, because think about it anyways. If they could have done that, they would have done it to Abaddon a long time ago.
Right.
I mean, if we think about the other Primarchs that became demon princes demon Primarchs, they all made a specific choice to become a demon Primarch.
Right.
So they actually said, yep, we're on board with this. But I just can't see Perturabo actually doing that, which is why this confuses me.
Borgar isn't considered a demon Primarch, is he?
Yes, he is.
Well, he didn't make that choice.
I think he did. Hang on, let me go through my notes here real quick. Let's see here. Lore of the 17 worlds. No. Past that. Lorgar. All right. We got Lorgar. We're going to scroll down. Let's see here. Okay, for my notes here, I've got eventually the atrocities committed by the word bearers led Lorgar's ascension to demonhood. He became the equal of a god in the eyes of the Legion as he transformed into a demon primarch in his own right. In his own right. Okay, so he apparently was okay with this. Although it does say, it is said his birth scream as a demon prince of Chaos Undivided echoed across the Immaterium with triumphant vindication. His faith and devotion to chaos rewarded with immortality and unbridled power. So, yeah, I think that kind of describes somebody that's really on board.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I just don't understand this. And for you guys listening, anyways, if you guys can figure out why on earth Perturabo would become a demon prince, go ahead. Let me hear it. Because apparently both Yuksen and I are missing something. And unfortunately, on that horrible note, we're out of time. In fact, we actually lit a little past time than we normally did. But I think Yuksen, you'll agree with me anyways. Perturabo is a fairly interesting character and worth talking about.
Yeah.
Join us next week as we wrap our heads around a single concept. Perturabo's sons are the least Chaos Space Marines, yet not loyalists, that you can get.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this box. Feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and comment. And don't forget to check out the shop. We got some cool stuff there, like clothes, pillows, and hats.
Yuksen? Yuksen?
Yes?
Don't forget the rabbits! I'm back!
What about the bears? Right. And don't forget about the rabbits.
We do have bears too.
Also, don't forget to put your questions in the comments so we have a boatload of them for our Q&A at the end of the month.
Have a great day. And as always,
Until next time, this is Zeckthar
And Yuksen.
signing off.